The Labour lot over there are banging on about playing politics with this important issue. But the last time I attended a debate on child rape gangs, there was just one Labour backbencher turned up. They should hang their heads in shame. But will the Home Secretary agree with me that we need a specific inquiry into why young British white girls are being systematically raped by men of Pakistani heritage?
Secretary.
We need to make sure that young people, that children are being protected. These are vile crimes against children, and across the country we have seen young girls, we have seen teenagers, and we have seen young boys who have been exploited in the most cruel and horrendous way by perpetrators. We have seen the abuse by Pakistani heritage gangs, paedophile gangs operating online. We have seen abuse in communities and institutions and in family homes. All of those crimes are truly horrendous. It's why after the Rotherham inquiry in 2014, when we saw the appalling abuse, including by a Pakistani heritage gang in that case, I called for the duty to report. I called for the law to be changed so that it was a responsibility on public servants to report child abuse and that it would be an offence to cover up child abuse. The government that he was part of for many years failed to bring that duty to report in. They failed to do so, and we have lost a decade. We have to change the law. We have to make sure that we go after abuse without fear or favour wherever it is found, in order to get justice for victims, protection for victims, and make sure that dangerous perpetrators end up behind bars.
Rape gangs and the grooming of children has haunted Keighley and the wider Bradford district for decades, yet local leaders have consistently refused to launch an inquiry. The National Independent ICSA report the Home Secretary is treating as a silver bullet wasn't an inquiry into rape gangs, and nor does it reference Keighley or Bradford once, despite many, including myself, fearing that the scale of this issue across the Bradford district will dwarf that of Rotherham. So if the Home Secretary believes that the ICSA report gives us all the information we need to tackle this vile and disgusting crime, can she tell me how many children across the Bradford district have been abused through child sexual exploitation? Who are the perpetrators? And when will my constituents expect to see them behind bars or deported?
Madam Deputy Speaker, there are appalling crimes that have taken place against children in Bradford, in Keighley and across the country. Truly appalling crimes. And we also have to, all of us, face up to the fact that child sexual abuse and exploitation continues. This is not just about historic crimes, this is about continuing crimes and abuse for hundreds of thousands of children across the country. And that is why it is so important, first of all, that we take forward the reforms that have been proposed, that we make sure we have the way to keep victims and survivors' voices at the very heart of this. But some of it has got to be about how we change the way that policing and councils work together, implementing changes and reforms, including on the duty to report. And what we are also doing, because he obviously raises particular local concerns, what we will also be doing is working with Tom Crowther and with the Victims and Survivors panel on how best local areas can best involve survivors and victims in what has happened in their area to make sure that victims and survivors are properly listened to, that they can get to the truth, and also that fundamental changes take place for the future.
Paul Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the last few days, my town's name, my hometown's name, Rochdale, has been exploited by some people who treat child rape as a political game rather than as an appalling crime that should be dealt with. The horrific abuse of children by grooming gangs, many of them predominantly Pakistani heritage grooming gangs, was compounded by failures by my local council and by the local police. All Rochdalians, whatever their background, want to see sex offenders prosecuted swiftly and punished harshly. So, can I welcome the Home Secretary's statement today, and can I ask her to leave no stone unturned in implementing all the recommendations of the J report, something the opposition signally failed to do?
Home Secretary.
Well, my right honourable friend is right to recognise the seriousness of these crimes. obviously the experiences in Rochdale, including not just the issues around gang networks and the Pakistani heritage gang networks that he talks about, but also some of the experiences in care homes that took place as well, some of the other issues that have been investigated over the years, and the terrible experiences of victims and survivors and their families as a result. But he's also right to say that what we actually need is change, and that has to be about how we work with victims and survivors on taking forward new reforms and changes, but also how we're going to have to go further in a series of areas, because the thing about child abuse and exploitation is that perpetrators change this all the time, and they look for new ways to abuse children, and that is what we have to keep tackling.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the most shocking details of the rape gangs is the evidence of collusion and corruption among police officers, social workers and local councillors. Will the Home Secretary commit today to establishing a unit in the NCA dedicated to investigating not only the untried perpetrators, but the police officers, social workers and local councillors complicit in these disgusting crimes?
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member makes an important point, which is that alongside the issues around pursuing the perpetrators, which always has to be the greatest priority, because that is about protecting victims and making sure those who commit vile crimes face justice, there also has to be a responsibility on people for their own public roles, whether that be in policing, in local councils, but also in other institutions, as we've seen issues around the Church of England, issues around the Catholic Church and other institutions that were investigated as part of the inquiry. But one of the reasons that we are so keen to change the law, and indeed it's something that I raised back when he was working in the Home Office, was the importance of changing the law on the duty to report, is that is what then makes it an offence if you have public officials who are covering up or who are failing to report. And that's why it's so important that we do that, so we can have proper accountability as well.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I sincerely commend the Home Secretary's statement. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse was extremely comprehensive. Over the course of 7 years, it examined 2 million pages of evidence and heard from over 7,000 survivors, every single one of whom we should pay tribute to today. They relived the most horrific trauma, only for the last government to drag its heels on implementing the report's recommendations. Calls now for a fresh inquiry from the Conservatives and Reform are a shameful attempt to stoke division at the expense of victims, survivors and children. So I thank the Home Secretary for refusing to give in to this deeply harmful and offensive political point scoring. And I ask, can she set out a timeline of when she expects to have fully implemented the ICSA recommendations?
Home Secretary.
Well, I think that the clear point, as my honourable friend says, is that victims and survivors need to be at the heart of the work to take forward implementation of reforms and changes. We want to work with the new Victims and Survivors panel in order to draw up timelines. And I do recognise that some of the areas around reform are difficult. So this is something where we need extensive work with victims and survivors on how to do so. But there are other areas that we can move really swiftly on, like changing the law on the duty to report, like changing and overhauling the way in which we collect information and data, and we have proper monitoring systems in place in local areas around child sexual exploitation and abuse. But what I hope we can build is the same sense of consensus about what our objectives are, which is to protect children. That's what this should all be about, and that is something that I hope everyone will sign up to.